The announcement of the isolationist J.D. Vance as the man who would be vice president under Donald Trump has set off alarm bells in Europe. The Ohio senator has been an outspoken critic of Washington's military and financial support for Ukraine. He played a central role in the effort to kill off an aid bill for Kyiv earlier this year in the Senate. And though that effort failed, J.D. Vance has consistently asserted that Europe's now become over-dependent on the US for its defence. Is it time to work out how we bring the war in Ukraine to a close? To discuss, let's bring in the former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Sir Richard Shirreff. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What was your instant reaction when you saw that Donald Trump had picked J.D. Vance?
Well, I think more of the same. I mean, the isolationist tendency is nothing new. And we know what Trump thinks. He's already said that he would end the war in 24 hours and stop aid to Ukraine. So no surprise, really. But I think the so what out of all this, of course, is it reinforces the need to Europe to really get its act together.
He said, it was an interview, I think, with Steve Bannon a couple of years ago. J.D. Vance actually went a bit further and he said, I don't really care what goes on over there. I don't know if Donald Trump thinks that, but I mean, is that another aspect of this? I understand it's isolationist, but this idea of just, this is very far away and it doesn't affect us. Presumably you think that's short-sighted.
Well, you absolutely put the one word I was thinking. It's extraordinarily short-sighted because history has demonstrated in the 20th century that Europe's security is America's security and vice versa. And three times America had to get involved in twice in a European war and once in a Cold War in Europe. And America didn't do that out of pure altruism. America did it for sheer naked self-interest. And the same applies today. So, I think we'll see what happens. I mean, let's make the assumption that Trump gets in, that Vance is vice president. I would suggest that 90% of the money that has been spent by the American Congress on aid for Ukraine has actually been spent in America, in American weapons factories, and providing jobs for Americans, many of whom will be voting for President Trump and J.D. Vance. So there's an element of self-interest here. And also the other point I'd make is that and rightly so, frankly, because Trump was right when he said Europe needed to step up more in its defense. And since that, in the last year or so, now we're up at about 22, 23 European nations spending that minimum 2% of GDP on defense, which is a significant improvement on a few years ago.
Yeah.
Europe is getting its act together.
And hopefully, and I suppose the hope there is that Donald Trump, if he becomes president, will take that on board and perhaps have a kind of a more sympathetic, who knows, attitude towards what's going on. Do you think the ceasefire negotiations with Russia would become more likely under a Trump presidency?
Well, he said it. He said it would. He said he's going to solve the war in 24 hours, and we've got to assume and that is, of course, is the worst case, because the first thing I'd say is that the Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. All my Ukrainian friends tell me, we know that if we stop fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist. So we're going to go on fighting either with you or without you. But nevertheless, if Trump came up with some so-called deal, that would give Putin the opportunity to declare victory, to reset, rebuild, regenerate, and retrain his armed forces. And make no mistake, he will have another go at eliminating Ukraine from the map as a sovereign country. Maybe not this year, not next year, but in 4 years' time. And once he's done that, he will continue to move on and be a real threat to NATO. So the only way the Euro-Atlantic community and NATO is going to be able to enjoy peace for the next generation plus, frankly, is to accept Ukraine as a NATO member and therefore to give Ukraine the support needed to defeat Russia in Ukraine.
Can you just explain for people who are in this country, in the United Kingdom, or people who are in Europe, who perhaps also agree with this isolationist view that some people in America have. Can you explain what the worst case scenario is? If you are in America and you think that this is a very distant thing that doesn't affect you, can you explain what might actually happen if President Putin is emboldened and is seen to have succeeded in some way through some kind of ceasefire negotiation, claims victory. What would that actually mean in terms of any kind of potential domino effect?
Well, to those people who might be questioning whether, your point about a ceasefire and believe that's a good idea, I would say that we are all bound by the terms of the NATO treaty. We're a member of NATO, as are 32 other or 31 other NATO nations. And we're bound under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that an armed attack on one is an attack on all. So let's just postulate, let's go 5, 6, 7, 8 years hence. Putin has managed, as a ceasefire has been declared. Putin has declared victory. He's built up his armed forces. He's moved on and has achieved his full aims in Ukraine. It is highly likely that he will have a go at the Baltic states or even Eastern Poland. And under those circumstances, that would mean that Britain, along with all other NATO nations, is at war with Russia, because it would be our treaty duty to come to the aid of a NATO member of attack. So this is the point. Our British security doesn't start at the White Cliffs of Dover. It starts in the forests of Lithuania, of Estonia, of Latvia, and on the eastern Polish border.
Okay.
And it starts with Ukraine as well.
Okay. Sir Richard Shirreff, thank you very much.
I remember at the time when I was Defence Secretary with my American counterpart warning the European members of NATO that the patience of American taxpayers would not be infinite, and they couldn't expect the United States to continue to carry European defence. In the last few years, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen European countries beginning to up their defence spending, but I don't think there is a sufficient capability yet in European NATO that will actually assuage some of the more hawkish elements in Washington. So it's good that Britain is taking the position of having another defence review, although if the reason for the defence review is the imminence of the threat that we face from North Korea, from Iran, from China, and from Russia, it does seem an awful long time to take nearly a year to do it. And the prospect of it not finishing till the end of next June, which would be a quarter of the Parliament, seems to be a very slow pace of events.
Okay, about an important review. And just on Ukraine, I want to come to that very, very quickly. Donald Trump has spoken and spoken again of forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin. And he now has a running mate, a potential vice president of the United States, who's every bit as hawkish on that subject. He has spoken, he has written about freezing the battle lines in Ukraine where they are. Vladimir Putin, Liam, must be rubbing his hands at that sort of idea.
Well, what people say, of course, in an American election campaign and what they do when they actually reach office is not always the same thing. But I think that the key thing is also to look at the views that exist in Congress, where most people will still take the view that Ukraine is a sovereign, democratic European nation that has been invaded and undergone a very bloody occupation and attacks on its civilians, which almost certainly have contravened international law in terms of war crimes. So the United States has a wider range of views than just whoever is in the White House at any one time. Yeah, but I think that I think what it will do is it will encourage European countries to understand that they can't ride on America's coattails forever on defence. In fact, I think it's now very clear that the peace dividend is over, and that all member states in NATO, but particularly European ones, need to understand that and also need to grasp that defence is not a discretionary spend. It's not like things like education or welfare. It's driven by the external threats that we face, which are increasing at the present time. And I think in Britain, there was a real chance missed in the general election to have a frank conversation with the British people to say the threat is going up in the world outside. The first duty of the government is to protect its citizens. That will almost certainly mean we have to raise defence spending. Yes. And that in turn, with limited economic growth, means that there will not be as much money in other areas that we would like to see for discretionary spending. And I think that argument needs to be made. And it's one thing having a defence review. As I say, I think it's taking too long. But we also need to have a frank conversation with the British people about where defence sits in the priorities of government spending.
Yeah, I mean, and you could perfectly well argue, quite convincingly argue, that Donald Trump's rhetoric on NATO, together with the obvious threat from Russia, has driven NATO members to up their game when it comes to spending money on defence. Equally, the language we've heard from Donald Trump and certainly from J.D. Vance on this subject, it doesn't sound like political rhetoric. It doesn't sound like election bluster. They seem to mean, certainly Vance seems to mean what he says, and there will be an awful lot of nervousness in Ukraine about the idea of being left exposed to that threat. Let me just ask you this, Vance. We saw him on tape. He said it a few days ago, mocking Britain as an Islamist state. What did you think? What did you feel watching that?
I think you've got to be a bit more thick-skinned than some people are being, and I think it was meant to be humorous, and why a lot of people won't see the joke in it. But I think we have to, get grown up about these things. The relationship with the United States, whoever becomes the president, will be our most important strategic and security relationship. I remember some of the things that were being said before the last Trump administration, that he would threaten the cohesion of NATO. He did no such thing. And so I'm a lot more relaxed than I think some people are trying to be ahead of this election.
Yeah, it doesn't suggest a huge amount of respect, though, Liam, does it?
Well, again, I think people that we're in this political culture where people seem to want to take offence. I don't. I think there are more important things to be talking about and getting on with in terms of the global security picture, which I think is deteriorating quite a lot. And when I look at the general picture of the American election, I look and I see that it's not just being watched by an American audience or even a Western audience, but it's being watched in Beijing, it's being watched in Moscow, it's being watched in Tehran, and therefore the strength of the United States economically and militarily that is projected throughout this presidential race by both sides is very important.
All right. So Liam Fox, former Conservative Defence Secretary, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.